So tonight is the last night of our current series. Series entitled Encounters with Reality, or Meeting the Tantric Guru. So since the new year, we've heard lots of stories of encounters, people's encounters with reality. From at the one end, the Buddha's mega breakthrough into reality under the Bodhi tree, his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, which has, as it were, echoed down time and reached us. As though a sort of light shone into the world of human beings, which is still sort of shining out. From that sort of mega encounter with reality, which has been lighting up millions of people's lives ever since, to more mundane encounters in which maybe single individuals have been led to see something important about themselves or about their relationship with the reality around them, which has changed them and changed their life. And we've been looking at what those encounters mean for us. And tonight, what I want to do, what I hope to do tonight, is to round off this series by talking more generally about the nature of our encounters with reality. I'll be asking, what can we really know? What can we really know about the nature of reality? And what can't we know about the nature of reality? What can we know? What can't we know? And what does this mean? What does this mean for the way we practice and the way we live our lives as Buddhists? So that's what I'm going to try and look at tonight to round off this series. So, in one of the very earliest collections of the Buddha's teachings and stories about the Buddha, the Buddha tells a story, or he tells a parable really, which is about our usual approach to knowing reality. And in this parable, the Buddha tells this story. He says, there was once a king. There was once this king. And this king, you're not going to like this king. He's not a very nice piece of work, this king, actually. You're not going to like him. But anyway, there was a king. And this king was getting a bit bored, so he said to one of his ministers, what I'd like you to do is go out, scour my realm, and I want you to find, I think it's 5, maybe it's 6 people. I want you to find 5 or 6 people, men who've been blind from birth and have never encountered an elephant. So that must have been pretty weird. They must go around knocking on doors saying, got anyone here who's been blind from birth? You ever met an elephant? No, I don't know what an elephant is. And until eventually they found 5 people who'd been blind from birth and never encountered an elephant. So the king, the ministers round up these, so the army probably goes out and says, you, down the palace. Anyway, so they got 5, maybe it's 6 people, men, who are blind from birth and have never encountered an elephant. And the king says, now get me an elephant. So he puts his elephant in the courtyard and he sort of sits up on the balcony and he says, now introduce the blind men to the elephant. And so, come blind men, this is an elephant. And one blind man grabs the elephant's trunk and he says, oh, an elephant is a really powerful big snake. And another man grabs the elephant's leg and says, oh, an elephant is a really big tree. And another man grabs the elephant's tusk and says, oh, an elephant is a beautiful, shiny, polished piece of wood. And another man grabs the elephant's ear and says, oh, an elephant is a sail. It's like a sail. And another man grabs the elephant's tail and says, oh, an elephant's a bell pull. It's a bell rope. Oh, it's not ringing. Heaven knows what would happen if you actually did that. Anyway, so they each say, oh, an elephant is this, an elephant is that, an elephant is the other. And then the king, this is where he really gets nasty, says, all right, take the elephant away. Convene a conference between these blind men as to what an elephant is. So they get the blind men together and say, oh, blind men, what is an elephant? And one blind man says, well, an elephant's a big, really powerful snake. And another one says, no, it's not. It's a tree. And another one says, no, it's like a really shiny, polished piece of wood. And another one says, no, it's a sail. And And I said, it's a bell pull, it's a bell rope. And then so they have an argument about this, and eventually there's fisticuffs. And meanwhile, the king is sitting up on his balcony, roaring with laughter, thinking this is just the funniest thing he's ever seen. Okay, there's a parable. So, I mean, the parable gets interpreted as saying that non-Buddhist teachers see only part of the truth, only part of reality. But really, I think the parable is saying something more general than that. I think it's saying something about how we know about the nature of things, about how we know about the nature of reality, the nature of truth. And it says something about how we humans interpret our encounters with reality. The blind men have an encounter with an elephant, which they interpret in various different ways. We interpret our encounters with reality in different ways. So the elephant represents reality. And that reality is beyond the experience and the imagination of the blind men. The minister was very careful to find out that the blind men had never encountered an elephant and they'd never seen one because they were blind from birth. So the elephant is beyond, they don't know what an elephant is. It's bigger, weirder, they're quite weird things, elephants. Beyond their experience, beyond their imagination. So then each has an encounter with an elephant, an encounter with reality. But they encounter just a part of it. They encounter just a part of that reality, an aspect of that reality. And because the whole elephant is beyond their experience and beyond their imagination, to try and make sense of an elephant, what they do is try to relate it to something that is within their experience. They've come across trees, they've come across snakes apparently, they've come across polished pieces of wood, sails, bell pulls. So they think of something in their experience which they use as a metaphor for the aspect of reality that they've encountered. So in that way they make sense out of their encounter with reality by coming up with a metaphor. An elephant is a tree, an elephant is a polished piece of wood. And that might be fair enough as far as it goes. It might be fair enough as far as it goes. But then each takes their metaphor literally as absolute truth, to the exclusion of all other metaphors. Each takes his metaphor too seriously and starts thinking that the metaphor they've used is the absolute truth and the only truth, and there's no other way of describing reality. That metaphor turns into a sort of dogma, which they then fight about. We've had religious wars, etc. If the blind men had understood the limits of their ability to actually understand reality, the limits of their abilities, they would say, not an elephant is a tree, but it's a bit as though an elephant were like a tree. Yeah? There's a big difference between saying an elephant is a tree and saying an elephant it's a bit as though an elephant were like a tree. If they'd said that, then they might have been able to sort of say, well, it's a bit like this and it's a bit like that. But if they're each hanging on to their own truth as the absolute truth, then they're just going to have an argument about it. So this is a parable about how we all, actually, I think, as humans, tend to approach what we know about reality. So we are quite like the blind men. The blind men didn't have the faculty needed to take in the elephant as a whole. They didn't have sights. They didn't have the faculty. They didn't have the machinery to take it in. And in our normal state, we don't have the faculty to perceive the whole of reality. Just think about it. Just to perceive the whole of one of those trees out there, you couldn't take in every leaf. You couldn't take. You look at it at subcellular level. It's just the detail involved in just looking at a tree would be beyond the human mind. Reality, we're kidding ourselves if we think we can take it in with our rational mind. We don't have the machinery to take in the whole of reality, just as the blind men didn't have the machinery to take in the elephant in our normal state. And also, we only ever experience an aspect of reality. We only ever come across an aspect of reality, limited as we are by time, by space. We can't think beyond time and space, really. And we've got these very limited rational minds. So, like the elephant, reality is beyond our experience and it's beyond our imagination. It's too big and it's too deep and it's too complex for our rather puny rational minds to take it in its entirety. So, we have our encounters, and then what do? Like the blind men, we have a strong, we then think of something in our experience that we can relate that to. And then we tend to take those, so we think of metaphors, we think in terms of metaphors, and then we tend to take those metaphors literally, as though they're the absolute truth, rather than they're as a way of saying, well, it's a bit like this, it can be a bit like this under certain circumstances. So in our time and in our culture, I think there are two really important ways that we people tend to take our metaphors too literally. We tend to say an elephant is a tree, or an elephant is a bell rope. And one is to insist that reality is just a sort of dead machine. So we don't have experience of the whole mystery and magic of reality, but we do know what machines are like. We know what machines are like. You pull this lever and that happens and that happens. It's all very automatic, and they don't think and they don't feel, and they're sort of dead. They are within our experience. And in some ways, from some points of view, it is indeed as if reality were a dead machine. If we look at the behaviour of the material world, then reality really does seem to behave in a sort of machine-like way. If we drop something, it accelerates at a particular rate that we can describe, a certain number of meters per second, which I can't remember, until it hits the ground. So if someone drops a brick from a high building, if you get in its way, if you stand under the brick, what anyone thinks or feels about that doesn't matter. You know, reality's not going to say, "Ooh, dear, he's a nice person, move that brick." Reality behaves like a dead machine. You get in its way, it does for you. So we know about machines, and because reality in some way behaves like a dead machine under some circumstances, some aspects of it, we extrapolate that and we say reality is a dead machine, and that's all it is. Reality is a dead, heartless machine, and that's all it is. We don't say it's in some ways as though reality were a dead machine. In a bit like that, in some ways, we say, no, it's a dead machine, and anything else must be wrong. That's all it is, and any other way of looking at it is wrong. It must be wrong, because if that's the way it is, then everything else is wrong. Treating reality like a dead machine is really, really useful. It's really, really useful for some tasks. If you're building a bridge or designing a high building, I really hope you treat reality like a dead machine, that you can absolutely predict the way it's going to behave. But if you say reality is just a dead machine, you're just like a blind man saying an elephant is just a tree. Or an elephant is just a polished piece of wood. And if we make that mistake and say, oh, reality is just a dead machine, then in that version of the world, in that metaphor, if that metaphor is taken literally as absolute truth, there can be no such things as higher spiritual values. Machines do not do higher spiritual values. Machines do not do ethics. In that world, any sort of spiritual experience must be a delusion. It must be something wrong with your mind. Any experience of deeper beauty, of great beauty, must be just something that human beings sort of created. It can't actually be there because it's just dead. And we human beings are part of that machine, so we must be machines as well. So we must have, the idea that we must be limited by our genetics and our biochemistry. That must determine our states of mind, and that must determine who we are. We are machines. Human beings are machines living in a dead machine world. Well, what the hell? It's just buy loads of stuff. What does it matter? So that is one way that we tend to take our metaphors too literally. Reality is a dead machine. We've got our elephant is a leg. Reality is a dead machine. And that's all it is, which must mean that we're also machines. The other way that some of us take our metaphors too literally in our society, or have done so, is almost the exact opposite. It's almost the exact opposite. We don't know reality in its entirety. We do know machines, what machines are like, and we also know what fathers are like. We know what fathers are like. And looked at from a certain point of view, it is indeed a bit as though the world were created by something that is a bit like our experience of a father. It looks after us when something looks after us, something wants us to develop. Something is basically kind, cares about us. But sometimes a bit judgmental and bad-tempered. Especially if we don't do what they say. So we see reality. Reality is ruled over by something a bit like something we know, a bit like a father. Reality is ruled over by a God who created it and us, and created us to have eternal souls. And those souls are important. So in that view of the world, well, ethics are vitally important. There are higher spiritual values. You wouldn't want to use that metaphor for building bridges. Yeah, I mean, I'd really be disappointed if an architect or a structural engineer thought that you could, relied on prayer or the grace of God. You wouldn't want to use that metaphor for building bridges. But if you want to use that metaphor for how do you have a meaningful life, how do you create deep relationships with others, how do you live an ethical life, how do you live a life that seems to have meaning, well, that metaphor is going to be a lot better than the dead machine one. But it's still a metaphor. It's still a metaphor. And it's still like saying an elephant is a bell rope. And if you take that metaphor literally, and take that idea literally, well, then it can lead to all sorts of things like crusades, with people whose idea is a bit different to yours, or flying aeroplanes into skyscrapers and whatever. Taking metaphors literally is a bit of a recipe for disaster. So reality is not just a dead machine, so that we are just dead machines, and reality has not been created by a father figure, God, so that we have unchanging immortal souls. These are just metaphors, stories about reality based on our limited experience. The truth is a middle way between nihilism and eternalism, something like that. These are just metaphors. They're just stories based on limited experience. And when we say reality is this way and it's only this way, this metaphor is completely right and all other metaphors must therefore be wrong. An elephant is just a tree and only just a tree. We imprison ourselves in a prison of our own making, which stops us from seeing that reality is bigger than any picture of it that we can draw. Okay, so, but where does that parable leave us? Where does that parable leave us as Buddhists? Is the Dharma, is Buddhism just another one of these attempts to describe reality through just a part of it and taking that too literally? Should we take the Dharma seriously as the real truth, or should we take it with a huge pinch of salt? Well, I don't think we should need to take the Dharma with a huge pinch of salt for a couple of reasons. I think the Dharma is a bit different. For one thing, the Dharma is not primarily setting out to give us a sort of metaphysical picture of the world. That's not what it's trying to do. The Buddha, Sangha Night, I think, described the Buddha as metaphysically reticent. So there was this really troublesome chap in the Pali Canon who kept asking the Buddha all the big questions. A guy called Vacchagotta. Is the body the same as the mind? Does an enlightened being continue to exist after death, or do they not exist after death? Is the world, etc., etc., etc. Is there a self or isn't there a self? He asked all these questions. And the Buddha really got up Vacchagotta's nose, because every time he was asked one of these questions, he would say, well, wouldn't it be true to say, wouldn't be true to say that an enlightened being does continue to exist after death, and it wouldn't be true to say that they cease to exist after death. And it wouldn't be true to say they both exist and cease to exist. And it wouldn't be true to say they neither exist. And Vajrayogota at one point says, "Now I am really confused, and the clarity I thought I had from my previous encounter with the Enlightened One has left me." So the Buddha didn't tend to sort of try and make these big pronouncements about the nature of things. He's basically saying, it's like asking what would happen to my house if the sky fell down. It's like asking what is there at the end of the rainbow. You know, it's like these are words that don't have meanings. They don't map onto reality. So the Buddha didn't tend to try and give us a metaphysical philosophy. He set out a path of practice. And the path of practice that he set out is designed to help us if we practiced it faithfully, if we live according to the principles he sets out. It's designed to help us to develop more of a faculty to see the whole elephant, actually, or at least to get some sense of what that whole elephant is, rather than trying to describe little bits of it. So that's one reason why I don't think the parable is saying, don't take the Dharma seriously. The second reason I don't think that the Dharma is, we should say, that means you don't take the Dharma seriously, is the Dharma, Buddhism at its best has got a really long tradition of being really, really clear that the metaphors and the stories we use to describe things are just that. They are metaphors and they are stories. They are not the absolute truth. We use them if they're useful, but we don't take them too completely literally. So there's a saying in the Zen tradition, they are fingers pointing at the moon. They are not the moon. Okay, that's a really, almost a constant theme through Buddhism is, this is going to be really useful, but sort of, it's a metaphor. It's, you can't get the absolute truth in words and concepts. So the great Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna had a lot to say about this. He had a lot to say about how do we deal with this apparent conflict between the fact that on the one hand, all the truths we can express in words and through ideas are not really cutting the mustard. They're not really getting at the nature of things. Yet at the same time, we want to practice as Buddhists. We think that the Dharma is showing us. How do we square that circle? How do we take it really seriously at the same time as saying, but all these words are just play words? So Nagarjuna, probably born 150 of the Christian era, probably came from southern India. Actually, scholars don't really know very much about him at all. We know his writings. Probably came from southern India, although there is also a tradition that he came from Maharashtra, which we quite like because he might have come from near Nagpur or somewhere, where we've got a lot of our Indian Buddhists. He seems to be fairly sure he studied and taught at the great monastic university at Nalanda in northern India, and the tradition says he was the abbot of Nalanda. And Nagarjuna, this great philosopher, he had his own encounter with reality, which is traditionally described in a very mythic way, as usually these things are. So it's said that Nagarjuna was given the texts on which his philosophy are based, the Sutras of the Perfection of Wisdom, by the Nagas. So, Nagas. Nagas are strange. Shane Bodhinaga's not here because he's a bit of a Naga himself. Nagas are, they're sort of a bit strange beings, really. They're serpents. They're sort of snake-like qualities. Sometimes they're shown as cobras. Snakes seem to always be associated with wisdom. They're associated with wisdom in our tradition, The snake that tempts Eve with knowledge. So snakes can be associated with wisdom. They're also a bit like dragons. They're a bit like, they fulfill a bit of the role that dragons do in our tradition. So dragons live in deep caves in the depths, and they often guard hoards of treasure. And you have to be a bit special to get at the treasure, like Bilbo in whatever it's called, Hobbit. You know, you have to sort of be cunning to get the treasure from the dragon. So yeah, they often guard valuable treasure, and they have a deep and subtle wisdom. They can shift their shapes. They can appear in human form when needed. And putting all this together, well, Nagas are creatures of the depths. So they're often said to live in palaces in the depths of the lakes. They live in these great Naga palaces. But their real domain is not really in the material world that we inhabit. Their real domain is a vast, deep realm, a different realm called the Bila Svarga, or subterranean heavens. They come from a sort of different realm entirely, really. But it represents the deep depths. And so Nagas often guard treasure, but the treasure that they often guard is often spiritual treasure. It's not material treasure. And the depths that they inhabit, they're not necessarily the depths of the lakes, they're more representative of the depths of the mind, the depths of the psyche, the depths of reality. And the tradition says, the myth says that the Buddha gave the Nagas the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras to guard until the world was ready for their appearance. Now you can sort of see why the Buddha might have done that in some sort of way, because if you ever read the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, my first response to the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras after reading them a bit was to want to throw them at the wall, actually. You know, sort of like, if you give me another bloody paradox, I'm just going to put you on the fire. They're just pile paradox on paradox on paradox. They try to just baffle the conceptual mind, really. They try to take the conceptual mind as far as it will go and then sort of go, it's like putting a food mixer into your skull. You know? They're really, really annoying. I mean, there's an author called Konza, who translated a lot of them, says if we don't find them deeply irritating, we haven't really got the point. So the tradition goes that the Buddha gave the Nagas, these creatures of the depths, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, to guard until the right person appeared who was going to actually be able to make some sense out of them. And apparently that person was Nagarjuna, because the tradition goes that, there's a couple of traditions actually, a couple of myths. One is that Nagarjuna, while he was abbot of Nalanda, two amazing, beautiful, handsome young men turned up who smelled of sandalwood all the time. And so Nagarjuna thought, this is a bit odd, you know, they smell of sandalwood. So he sort of said, well, why do you smell of sandalwood all the time? He said, well, it's good. You got us, fair cop, it's because we're Nagas. We're just sort of checking you out. We're checking you out. You seem pretty good guys. So I tell you what, if you come back with us, we got something for you. So the tradition goes that then they took him to the palace of the Nagas in the depths, and the king of the Nagas gave him the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. There's another tradition that he was given them by a beautiful Naga princess who appeared out of a lake. So you get different myths, but the idea is they sort of come from the depths, as it were. They come from somewhere deeper and more profound than the merely rational mind. And in some way, the very intention is to boggle the rational mind. So the tradition is that they didn't appear until there was somebody capable of interpreting them. Nagarjuna did that. He established the philosophical school called the Majjhimaka, the middle way, which is based on an interpretation of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And the gist, I mean, try and sum up a whole school in a short talk, especially as it's quite abstruse in some ways, but the gist, I reckon the gist of what Nagarjuna was getting at, is quite simply that reality cannot be contained or adequately described by anything we can say about it, or any concept or idea we can formulate about it. It cannot be captured in words. It is ineffable. In the Majjhimaka tradition, words are often called mere play words, and concepts built out of words are just castles in the air. They're just castles in the air. Mental proliferation. You just proliferate ideas and concepts. So, back to the parable, reality can never be imprisoned in words, if you like. All we can ever say is it's a bit as though reality is like this. That's as close as we can get. But reality will always be bigger, greater, deeper, qualitatively different from anything we can say about it or any of our ideas about it. That, I think, is the gist of Nagarjuna's middle way teachings. Blah, blah, blah. We might find that a bit difficult to really take on board, because in our culture we actually have a tendency to mistake our ideas about reality for reality, a really strong tendency, I think. So maybe an illustration would help, or maybe a couple of illustrations would help. The colour blue, our experience of the colour blue. Imagine, going back to people who've been blind from birth, imagine trying to describe the colour blue to somebody who has been blind from birth. You cannot convey the experience through words. How could you describe it? You could say something like, well, the colour blue is a really cool colour, a bit like the sea, a bit like water. Or you could say, oh, the colour blue is really quite a warm thing, a bit like a sunny summer sky. And then a rationalist would say, well, you just said it's cold and it's warm. How can it be both? But you're trying to convey something about the colour blue here. Yes, or even worse than trying to sort of find metaphors about it, it's sort of cool colour, it's a hot colour. We could we could be scientific. We could say it is light of such and such a frequency. But none of this will convey the experience. The experience is the reality, and the experience is qualitatively different from anything we can say about it or any ideas that we can have about it. Or take the experience of the beauty of a sunset. Say you're absolutely wrapped in the beauty of a sunset. I don't know if you've ever done this. You've been sitting on a beach or up in the mountains on your own and you see the sunset and you just lost in the beauty of the sunset. Could you ever describe and convey that experience to somebody else? There were strips of red and there were strips of yellow and the clouds did this and, what's that going to get you? The best approach might be poetry. You might be a poet might be able to do it. A poet might be able to do it. Or even music might be better than a sort of straight description. Something that made no attempt to reproduce it exactly, but just conveyed the feelings and the atmosphere, the response. The very worst way would be to try to convey something real about the sunset through some sort of scientific description. There was light of this and that wavelength because it was refracted by these and that levels of the atmosphere. You're never going to get the experience across like that. The reality is the experience of the sunset, which involves both the viewer and the world out there. It's a non-dual experience of something. It involves both the person experiencing and the world out there, and it is simply not conveyable in words. So that is the gist, I think, of Nagarjuna's philosophy. The wisdom he got from the depths of the Nagas, his interpretation of the completely enigmatic Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, is that the things that we can say about reality and the ideas and concepts we can make up about reality can never adequately describe reality. Reality is ineffable. It is beyond our limited intellect. All we ever do when we try to put reality in a neat little box that our rational mind can sort of file away somewhere and say, I know that now. An elephant is a tree, an elephant is a piece of polished wood, or that will never get us anywhere. If we want to get anywhere near wisdom, we need to remember to say instead, it's a bit as if reality were a tree, or whatever. We need to remember that we can never really know. We can never really know in the neat way that we can say, no, that the area of a rectangle is got by multiplying the length of the one side by the other. We can't know reality like that. We know it by a different sort of faculty, which we have to develop through meditation, through ethics, etc. So reality can never be conveyed in that way. We can't know reality in that neat way. But then we come back to this thing, well, what about the Dharma? What about the Dharma? Well, Nagarjuna actually dealt with that. Nagarjuna took this very seriously. He said, yes, this is true. At the ultimate level, you cannot know reality. But if you take that the wrong way, it will be disastrous for you. If you take that to mean that spiritual teachings are just, you can take them or leave them, they're just words, it will be disastrous for you. It will be like picking up a snake the wrong way. So he made the distinction between what he called absolute truth and conventional truth. And he said the absolute truth is that reality, the absolute truth is completely beyond words and concepts. We can only know it by direct experience, perhaps by meditative experience, in the same way that we can only know the colour blue or a beautiful sunset by direct experience. We can only know it by direct experience. But, and it's a huge but, we absolutely need the concepts, the teachings that can be expressed in words, which he called the relative truth. He said, okay, they're not the absolute truth, but you abandon those, you're done for. We absolutely need to take completely seriously the relative truth. So a sort of analogy that can be used for absolute truth, relative truth, if you like, is the difference between a map and the territory that the map describes. So a map is only ever very diagrammatic. A map of France can't tell you the taste of a galette or the taste of a bottle of wine down in Provence, or what they're doing in that flat in Paris or whatever. The map is incredibly simplified. But if you want to find your way to Paris, the map's quite useful. So the map is never the reality, but it's really good to have maps actually, because otherwise you wander around. I once. If your map is wrong, you could set out for Paris and end up in Grimethorpe. So we need good maps. And Nagarjuna is saying, actually, the Dharma is a really, really good map. Don't think it's the reality it maps, but it's a really good map. Use it. You must use this map. So the relative truth is vitally important, is what he's saying. So what does this tell us about our practice? What can we say about our practice? I think one of the things we can say about our practice is that we need to stay open to the fact that we don't know. That reality is more. It's more than we think it is. That there is more than just the surface that we see. There are depths. There are heights. And we need to be open to our experience of that. We need to be open to those glimpses that we get of the depths and the heights that lie behind the surface reality. However they come, whether they come through our experiences of nature, beauty through the arts, meditation. We mustn't cut those off by being rational, by rational skepticism. No, reality is just a machine, so that can't be real. We mustn't do that. If Avalokiteshvara appears and writes the Noble Eightfold Path in lipstick on our bedroom mirror, Great! It's happened! You couldn't possibly have done that. Somebody must have snuck in the night. No, I'm being silly here, but what we often do is we discount our experiences of the depths and the heights of things because we think we know, and especially because we think we know that the world's a dead machine. If the world's a dead machine, then that dream was just a dream, my mind was just firing off, that meditation experience was it's just in the mind, doesn't mean anything, etc., etc. I think we should take those experiences seriously. They are reality. They are the reality. They are glimpses into the depths and the heights of reality. Not just a trick of the mind. Not just a trick of the mind. So that's one thing. Be open to our experience. Be open to the fact that reality could be more miraculous, more wonderful, more magical than anything we know or imagine. And if we get glimpses of that, great. Don't rationalise them out of existence by saying, oh no, it can't be that. An elephant's just a tree. An elephant could be bigger than we can imagine. So if we do get glimpses, don't rationalise them out of existence, but also don't try to capture them too tightly, as the blind men do. Yeah? We may have an encounter with reality, but we need to sit a bit light to any sort of way that we can describe it. Not get fixated on words and concepts about it. Certainly not get sort of pumped up by the fact that we've had it. I've had this wonderful experience. So stay receptive. But somehow sit light to our interpretations of things. If that makes any sense. It's when we get really sort of dogmatic about about our interpretations of things that experiences like that can actually become negative. Be open to it, but don't try and put it too much in a box. Stay receptive, but at the same time as staying receptive, at the same time as knowing we don't know, I think we have to take the conventional truth of the Dharma very, very seriously. Somewhere. Yeah, we have to practice diligently according to the conventional truth. We need the map. The map's not the territory, but we really need that map. It's a really good map. We practice according to the map. I think especially we practice according to the law of karma. The idea that the way we act now, the way we use our mind now, is going to create the person we become in the future. That's the central truth of Buddhism. And if we lose that, we're done for, really. That's the central truth. So we need that map. We need to take the law of karma really, really seriously. We need to practice the precepts. We need to practice kindness. We need to practice generosity. We need to practice contentment. We need to practice openness. We need to practice awareness. We need to meditate. We need to develop mindfulness and metta. We need to put ourselves in supportive conditions. Put ourselves among the Sangha. Keep in touch with the Sangha. Keep in touch with spiritual friends. Put ourselves in supportive conditions on retreats. If we do all of that, then that's following the map, and that will allow us to see more and more of the entirety of the elephant. So that's something about how we know and what we know. Okay.